I mentioned the Gemara, that the Gemara says that Torah is compared to three liquids: to wine, to water, and to milk. Why is it compared to water? Because just as water flows from an elevated location to a low location, the Torah itself can only be processed and retained in a person who has a low spirit, meaning a person who has humility. Who is the repository for Torah to be able to retain that level of knowledge? Only the person who's humble. The person who could only approach that knowledge and merit the divine assistance to come upon its truth, you have to have the characteristic, the quality of humility. That's water. That's the characteristic of water. Wine, as we discussed yesterday, wine, to retain its pristine quality, you can't have anything else intermingling with the wine, such as ego. You have your own spin on it. Because the moment you have your own self-interest, immediately that occludes the ability to recognize the truth of what you're trying to analyze. Because you already have your preconceived ideas based on your own ego. And milk, because milk, any degree of uncleanliness goes into the milk spoils. The Torah itself has to be kept at that pristine, pure level. And if you allow anything impure to intermingle with the Torah actually, it's like the milk sours and becomes putrid. It becomes putrid, and it doesn't turn out to be what it's supposed to be. That's why it's compared to these three liquids. It has those characteristics of these three liquids. So the first two is really, if you're humble, you have the first two. You have the characteristic of water and wine, if you have true humility. The third is, if you don't have impurity in your mind or in your behavior, then you're an appropriate receptacle to be able to retain the Torah itself and to process the Torah. Okay, that's the idea. Moshe was the ultimate. Moshe received the Torah at Sinai. He was the representative of the Jewish people, to be the conduit from God to transmit that Torah, the word of God, to the Jewish people. Why was Moshe chosen? To be the one to receive the Torah. Well, Moshe, we know, the Torah, God himself attests to the fact that there was no more humble person who ever existed than Moshe Rabbeinu. He was negated to God. There wasn't a trace of himself. Therefore, that was his overwhelming profile. He did not exist. There was no Moshe. Every aspect of Moshe was for the sake of God. No self-interest whatsoever. That's number one. Now, the Torah had to be given to the Jewish people. None of the Jewish people in their own right had the capacity to receive the Torah. We had mentioned that the dimension of Moshe's soul was the equivalent of the whole Jewish people combined. So Moshe received the Torah as one individual. It was the equivalent of the whole Jewish people receiving the Torah. And he was the only one who had that dimension of spirituality and had that capacity. And therefore, he's the one who received the Torah on behalf of the Jewish people, because he is the equivalent of the Jewish people. And then after he received it, he transmits it. But whoever he transmits it to, he's not transmitting it to the entire Jewish people. Now, he's giving the responsibility to an individual who has a capacity to transmit what he received. But to be able to receive it from the source, only Moshe Rabbeinu could receive it from the source. Because the only person who has relevance to God at that level, you have to have the dimension of the entire Jewish people. And the only person who had that dimension was only Moshe Rabbeinu. Because the dimension of his soul was the entire Jewish people itself. That's the understanding. So that Moshe had to receive the Torah from Sinai, that's understood. Besara Yeshua, he transmitted to Yeshua. Yeshua was his successor. When Moshe passed away, God says, you will pass your spirit over onto Yeshua, onto Joshua. He will be the one who will bring the Jewish people into the promised land. Now the question is, why did he give it to Yeshua? Now you'd say, well, it's evident. If God chose Yeshua to be Moshe's successor, evidently he was the most qualified to be the equivalent of Moshe. But Moshe only knew that later. Initially, he didn't realize Yeshua would be his successor. He was handpicked by God to be Moshe's successor. But when he transmitted the Torah to Yeshua to give that responsibility, it wasn't at that last moment. So why did he give that responsibility of transmission to transmit it in its perfect form as he received it, to take that responsibility and every nuance of the transmission is exactly as he received it from God at Sinai? And there were other people we find later. There was Pinchas, who was the grandson of Aaron, who was the zealot who killed Zimri. And if not for his zealotry, God would have destroyed the Jewish people. So he was negated to God to such a level that he was willing to die because he could not tolerate the desecration of God's name as a result of the prince of Shimon's behavior, that it was a public disgrace of God. And as a result of that, he was a Levi, but he graduated to be a Kohen. And God openly says, if not for the zealotry of Pinchas, I would have destroyed the Jewish people. So he brought about the ultimate atonement. And therefore he transitioned to Kohen, although he was never anointed. The act of zealotry was the equivalent of anointment. So why wasn't he qualified to be the so-called the transmitter of Torah, to take on that level of responsibility? So Rashi in his commentary explains, and it says, it was transmitted to Yeshua. Elazar was the high priest. He was his father's successor. But Aaron passed away. Who became the high priest? Elazar. So why wasn't Elazar the one to take that level of responsibility to transmit to, or Pinchas? What about the 70 elders who Moshe's spirit was transmitted onto them? Why weren't they qualified to be the ones to be the responsible for the transmission of the Torah? Now, in this week's reading, we read about the laws of the red heifer. And the Torah uses a certain terminology. It says, Zosa Torah, this is the Torah, Odob ki yomas bo'oel, a man who dies in the tent. And we said many times, the appellation of Odom is referring to the Jewish people. And that's the reason why only the remains of a Jew contaminates in a tent. The remains of a non-Jew does not contaminate, only upon contact. But if you walk into a room where you have the remains of a Jew, even though you did not come in contact with the remains, you become contaminated. Because the Torah says, Zosa Torah Odom ki yamasmo. The person who's classified as Odom. We were classified with classification of Adam pre-sin. Of course, he has that dimension of holiness, of spirituality, which generates that level of contamination, which we discussed. But the Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us, the Midrash tells us, Zosa Torah, Odom ki yomas bo'oel, Eina Torah niknis, ela mishe memis atzmo leo. The Torah could only be acquired by a person who's willing to die for the Torah. You have to be so dedicated to come upon its truth, you're willing to forego all the physical amenities of life. That is the equivalent. You're willing to die for the Torah. And what is dying for the Torah? It's the mission towards the end of Pirkei Avos. Pasmel tochal. Even if you have only bread and salt to eat. You know something? If that's what it takes, and if I have to only be limited to that, I'm willing to give up everything only to have that. That's the most basic subsistence, to be able to survive. Mein besura tishta. Even if I have a small measure of water, but it's enough to survive, I'm okay. Al oretz tishon. I don't even have a bed to sleep on. I'll sleep on the floor. It's not, no comforts. If that's what I have to do, I'm willing to give that up for the sake of Torah. Chai tzar tichya. You live a life of deprivation because you're giving up all the amenities. If you're willing to do that, then you have the capacity to acquire the Torah. Torah can only be acquired by a person who's willing to forego everything. Because what's primary, that's essential, and that's the purpose of existence. So for what it takes to address the objective of your existence, to give it all up, doesn't say you have to. If you're willing to give it up, then you're the candidate to merit God's intervention to assist you to come upon His truth. But if it's something which is casual, something which take it or leave it, and you'll daintily dance around it or in it, you're not sufficiently dedicated to it that God will gift it to you. You have to be willing to give up the amenities of life. It has to be with all your soul. You have to love God with all your soul, and therefore you're willing to sacrifice on its behalf. That's Zosa to Adam Kiyomus Boel. You're willing to die. Everything takes the back seat. We read in Pirkei Avos, a number of people say it. Asei Torah Sakeva Amlacht Charai. Your Torah should be primary, and your work is secondary. Meaning that anything you're engaging in the physical and the material is only to facilitate the spiritual. That should be the approach to life. What do I work? To have the car, to have the house, to have the yacht, to have the vacation? Or I work to be able to be a Jew and live up to God's expectation of myself, except I need the comfort to be in a state of mind, to be able to be relaxed and rested, to be able to study the Torah. Why do I eat quality food? Why do I want to be healthy? Not to be a specimen of good health, but rather to be able to maximize on my ability to invest myself fully in Torah and have the greatest return. So that's Torah's Chekeva. That Torah is primary. Everything revolves around the Torah. I'll give you an example. A person's given an opportunity to go into a diamond mine and for a year mine 100 the flawless carats. And in a year he can mine and take enough diamonds out of that mine that he could support the next 1,000 years of his descendants. But during that year, he's going to inhale dust. He's going to lacerate his hands. He's going to be sleep deprived. He'll come out with impaired vision because of the lighting and because of the dampness and whatever else. But you know something? It's worth it. Because if the outcome of that is that I'll be able to support comfortably without any financial the next 1,000 years of my descendants, it's a win-win. But look at the cost factor. The cost factor is a pittance. If you look at the end result of what you're bringing about, if you say the end result is what? More pleasure, you know something? I prefer to be healthy and not impaired and have less than have more. But this is not having less than have more. It's addressing your objective to provide that they should be able to exist as they should exist. Not they should be hedonists due to what I'm doing today. So therefore you do it. There's a story with the Chazon Ish. You know, during the 1800s, there was a movement that was established in Lithuania and Russia. It was called the Enlightenment movement. The Enlightenment movement in Russia and Lithuania was the equivalent of the Reform movement in Germany and Hungary. They actually rejected the authenticity, the spirituality of Judaism, and they turned it, at best, it's cultural. It's cultural. And the religion in Lithuania and Russia became Yiddish. They were called Yiddishists. They were called Bundists. And they were cultural Jews. And they gave up God. They did not believe in God. They believed in a Jewish culture. There's a Jewish tribe. Jews are elitists, Jews are more intelligent, and whatever they kept, the language, that's what kept them together. And what was the language? Not Hebrew, the language was Yiddish. If you remember, in the 50s, there were schools in the especially in New York area, they were called workman circle schools. And children, they came back from public school, they would attend these schools for a few hours, and they would teach them how to speak Yiddish. These are American kids, speak Yiddish and tell over stories about Shalom Aleichem, because all these people, all these Jewish writers, they were all Yiddishists. They were Bundists. They had no relevance to Judaism, no relevance to God. Okay? Finally, they make Aliyah, they go to Israel, pioneers, and they established the kibbutz movement in Israel, and they have kibbutzim. They're called Shomer HaTzair. Shomer HaTzair was the kibbutz of atheism. They believed in no God. They didn't believe in marriage. It was literally like commune living. I mean, they married, but no, God was not part of their life whatsoever. It was Shomer HaTzair. And the Panovich Rav, his name was Rav Shlomo Yosef Kahaneman. That was his name. He was a Kohen. He was the chief rabbi of a community in Lithuania, Russia, or Latvia. It was called Panovich. Panovich had 10,000 Jews. There was not one survivor. The Nazis, Yamach Shmom, annihilated every single Jew in the community of Panovich. They locked down the borders. Every Jew was killed. The reason why the Panovich Rav, and he had one sort of survived, because when they shut down the borders, he was visiting a son who was living in Palestine at the time. That's the only reason why he survived. But his wife and 8 children were murdered by the Nazis together with his whole community. And he was a man who was gifted, a genius, and phenomenal capability. And he made a commitment that he would rebuild what was in Europe. And he went to Bnei Brak, which is a city in Israel. And when he came to Bnei Brak, at the beginning of the war, 1940, 1941, it was all sand dunes. And he went and he purchased properties. Where did he get money from? Because in the 20s, South Africa was comprised of Lithuanian Jews. And they were slightly traditional. And the Lithuanian Jews, even today, they all come from Lithuanian backgrounds. And the Panovich Rav, when he came to South Africa in the 20s, and he had the persona of a Lithuanian rabbi, chief rabbi, this was like a prince came. And they were very wealthy. Very wealthy. The Jews in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, in Durban, very wealthy Jews. They were not observant, but they were very Jewish. And when he came, they rolled out the red carpet. And they supported his community in Europe. In Panovich, the schools, whatever was needed, they supported it. So he had all these relationships. And after the war, when he wanted to rebuild Panovich, the South African community provided the funds to build the Panovich Yeshiva in Bnei Brak. The majority of the money came from the South African community because they were wealthy, and that's what happened. So he established an elementary school for the survivors when they came over after they were 13, 12 years old, that they should be able to be given a Jewish education, because in Europe, the war interrupted, and these were the survivors. These children, many of them were in concentration camps. And their formative years, they weren't given the proper education. They were denied, or they were in hiding. So he provided that. Then he had a high school, post-high school, more advanced, that people came, and it became the premier yeshiva in Israel. He built a phenomenal yeshiva. And he had the best faculty, the greatest Talmidei Chachamim, who are the future Torah sages of the post-war, who survived the war. He hired them to be his faculty. and they mentored students, and they disseminated Torah at a very special level. Okay? One day, about 15 young men come, and they show up in the Panovich Yeshiva. And there they're studying, they're wearing jackets and hats and dressed very modestly. And these 15 boys show up, teenagers. They're, tanned, beautiful tan, because they were working in the sun all day from a kibbutz. In those days, they had a thing called a temba hat. Remember what a temba hat was? It was a hat, you used to see kids climbing ladders, picking oranges in the orange grove. They had like a hat they wore, it looked like a cone on top of their heads. It was a blue and white hat. And they had shorts that were rolled up. And they had the sleeves were rolled up. And they come into the Panovich Yeshiva. And they came from a Shomer Hatzoah kibbutz. They came, their parents were atheists, believed in nothing. And they come into the yeshiva, and they go over to the rabbi, and they say, we would like to study Torah. Hear this. These kids that came from a background, their parents were atheists, but they knew they were Jewish. They said, we want to study Torah. These kids didn't know, they knew that the Hebrew alphabet because they spoke Hebrew. But in terms of Judaism, they knew nothing. So right away, the rabbi said, we don't think you really, this is not the place for you. Here we're already at an advanced level, this and that. We're going to go consult with the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish was in Bnei Brak. Chazon Ish was the leading Torah sage in the world at the time, especially post-World War II. And the Chazon Ish said, you have to do whatever you can, even to create a new curriculum to accommodate these young boys. So they said to Chazon Ish, how's it possible that parents gave it up and they despised it and they desecrated it, and the children now they have an interest in coming back to Judaism? How's it possible? So Chazon Ish said, when communism and all the anarchism, whatever the isms were in Russia, and they took Sifrei Torah, the Bundes, and they burnt Sifrei Torah, they made mass fires, and they took the Sifrei Torah and they threw them into the fire. That's how opposed. They despised Judaism with a passion. They wanted to destroy it. They weren't just, they didn't believe in God. They could not tolerate it. He says, but all these people, who do you think the parents were? They were observant Jews. What do you think they went? What do you think they did when they saw their children going out the door and becoming this type of person? The Chazon Ish, you know what they did? They went to the main synagogue in the community. They opened the Aron Kodesh, and they cried their hearts out to God. That's what they did. That Hashem should have mercy on them, and their children, to bring their children back, despite where they're at. It was the greatest pain of their life. And the Chazon Ish said, no tear goes unanswered. It may have not helped their children, but it's helping their grandchildren. Because of those prayers and the tears of the grandmothers and grandfathers who cried their hearts out, that's why these children at the age of 15 are coming from this kind of kibbutz, which is atheistic, and they said, we want to learn Torah. Therefore, there's going to be no stone unturned. We're going to create a curriculum that these Jews should have, these boys should have every opportunity to become observant and committed Jews. And it happened. And due to what the Chazon Ish said, and the Panovich Rav, Rabbi Kahneman, they created this, and they all became observant Jews. This is what happened. You never know. There's a certain person, which everybody knows who he is, and there's two words: philanthropist, and this is what we call a Baal Tzedakah. A Baal Tzedakah is a person who gives charity, but the term Baal Tzedakah means he gives charity to certain causes that the philanthropist may not give charity to. And over the years, he's given endless millions of dollars, and he's a close student of mine. And he has a relationship with Rabbi Pinto. And when Rabbi Pinto first met him, Rabbi Pinto said to him, do you know why today you're an observant Jew? And do you know why God gave you such blessing? Because you had an ancestor, just tell him what he told him, who lived in Greece. not that long ago, maybe 150 years ago, and he was murdered, and he gave his life al Kiddush Hashem. He was given an ultimatum, whatever the ultimatum was, to give up his Judaism, and he was put to death because he would not. In the merit of that ancestor, that's why today you're an observant Jew, and that's why you have this level of financial success, which is unmatched by most people. That's what Rabbi Pinto told him. Where does it come from? It's my genius, your genius, whose genius? It comes from somewhere. Nothing happens in a vacuum. God forbid a person has a microscopic cell of cancer. That cell could develop into something which ultimately takes over the person's life in the negative. Identically, you could have something tucked away, buried somewhere, what we call schus, a merit. And that merit, when it's ready to really start sprouting, it takes over a person's life in the positive. You come upon new interests, new horizons, new opportunities, successes, and one leads to the other, and ultimately you become a very significant person in the Jewish community, in your own life, in your family's life. You become a motivator, and what they used to call a mover and a shaker. They used to call mover and shakers in Wall Street. The real mover and shaker is this type of person, where he makes a difference not only in the physical world, even the spiritual world. Right, Larry.
Okay, so Rabbi, in the past you've used the word cleave. It's a wonderful word, and you talk about cleaving to God. I'm sorry, there's sirens in the background here. And my question is, we're supposed to emulate the actions and or the characteristics of God, or are they one and the same? And if that's the case, do we then think that God is within us? And based on that, how do we have status that we've cleaved to God?
Okay. You have a dog, you have a monkey. It's not a human being. An animal does not have a soul. What is a soul? A soul is the spiritual component of every human being. That's the essence of the person. And our actions have a bearing on what happens to that soul. The core of a human being is a soul. The core of any living creature other than a human being is its life source, and its value is only whatever it is. The value of a dog is a dog, and a cat is a cat, and a gorilla is a gorilla. Whatever that value versus the totality of the world. A human being, his value is not his physicality. His value is his soul, and his physicality is to facilitate and to develop the soul, and not to destroy it, to diminish it, but to advance it. But that is the core of the person. If the person makes enough right decisions and goes in the direction that follows God's narrative, and you enhance that soul, that means you're actually demonstrating and creating a spiritual profile for yourself, which reflects who God is. But you can only reflect who God is because your core is really infused by God. As it says, by Adam, God blew through his nostrils a soul of life. That soul of life is the soul. That's the soul. And that soul is why we're able to have relevance to God. It's not our physicality that has relevance to God. It's like a monkey. You could have an animal to associate with you, but it's not part of your life. It may be alongside you. Could you one moment? Hello? Hello? Ani bem seshira, ani יכול להחזיר טלפון עוד כמה דקות. You understand? So therefore, God is within us, what it means we have a soul. If we make choices, and God gave us a whole menu, how do you have a relationship with me? You know, if you want to become a diplomat, you go to diplomat school. And they teach you many things, how to interact with heads of state. But initially, to go to diplomat school, you have to have a certain degree of IQ, you have a certain degree of education, you have to be able to speak the language. And now they teach you the nuances and other things, give you other information, how to advance and how to have relevance to that function of being a diplomat. But if you're already a diplomat and you become good at it, you're able to have relationships with people within the political arena of the world because you've advanced it to be able to have relationships even with heads of states. Other diplomats, they stay at the bottom rung of the diplomatic corps, but they're not the ultimate, identically. The soul is where it begins. You leave it dormant, nothing, you have no relevance to God. You develop it, that means you're already living as a spiritual being who use this physicality to facilitate and to actualize the soul. Then you have relevance to God. Then you could cleave to him. Because otherwise you're just a physical being with a spiritual component which is undeveloped. I'll give you an example. You have a person who's born, unfortunately, but the person's a vegetable. No more than a vegetable. Even his physical function has very limited function. His soul is not developed. He can't make decisions. So what exactly could this person, although he's a living human being, could he have relevance or relation with anyone? No. All he can do is he can be pitied. That's about it. So a person who does not address his soul, he's like that non-functional human being. That's all he is. And it's unfortunate, it's pitiful. Because he has opportunity and a capacity and a capability to bring himself to an unbelievable level, to have a connection and a relation with the Creator, which is the ultimate, and somehow he turned a blind eye on it, turned his back on it. And he remains this limited person who's no more than the vegetable, who has a soul in him, a spiritual core which has never been touched.